My husband abandoned me and our sick son, and I thought that would be the end of my world. But I had no idea how that moment would completely transform our lives. It was 10 o'clock at night, and our small house was wrapped in complete silence, except for Julian's weak breathing. My precious 5-year-old boy was lying on the couch, wrapped in blankets, looking so fragile it broke my heart. His pale skin and weakened body, ravaged by illness, was almost too painful for me to look at. I fought back tears as I gently placed a damp cloth on his forehead, just as I had done countless nights before. Every day was a battle, and at night the weight of loneliness crushed me in this silent war. Across the room, Jonathan was roughly stuffing clothes into his suitcase, each movement like a hammer blow to my heart. The tension in the air was so thick that it was difficult to even breathe. I watched him from the corner of the room, feeling my heart shatter into smaller pieces with each item he tossed into that suitcase. "You can't abandon us now," I whispered, my voice trembling and barely audible, afraid of waking Julian. Jonathan didn't even look up when he told me he couldn't do this anymore, that he wasn't a saint, that he couldn't bear this burden. I approached him, my eyes filled with desperation, reminding him that Julian was his son and asking how I could possibly manage alone. When he finally stopped packing and looked at me, I searched his eyes for any trace of the man who once promised to stay, for better or worse, but found nothing. Without a hint of remorse, he told me there was no saving this, that this situation would destroy us all. Then he lowered his voice to a cruel whisper and said we wouldn't get anywhere without him. The words pierced my soul, and an inexpressible chill ran through my entire body. Jonathan closed his suitcase, completely indifferent to my reaction, and walked toward the door without looking back. Even after he left, the bitter smell of betrayal lingered in the air. Then we heard it, a weak "daddy," cutting through the tension between us. Jonathan turned to see Julian standing in the living room doorway, his cheeks flushed with fever, his small body swaying slightly. The pain was evident in his tiny frame, and he could barely get the words out when he asked if his father would come back. For a moment, I hoped Jonathan would pause, would finally realize the cruelty of what he was doing. But all he offered was a bitter smile and an indifferent response, telling Julian to go to bed, that this was grown-up business. Little Julian stood there with his head hung low, unable to move. His father slipped through the door and disappeared into the city streets, the sound of his rolling suitcase echoing behind him. We were left behind, abandoned and alone. I rushed to my son and wrapped my arms around his tiny body. Julian leaned into my embrace, not fully understanding what had just happened. "Don't worry, sweetheart, everything will be all right," I whispered, kissing his fevered head. "We'll get through this together, no matter how hard it gets." But even as I said those words, I couldn't believe them myself. It felt like my world was crumbling around me. There I was, with my sick 5-year-old son, no money in our accounts, mounting medical bills, and now completely alone. In the distance, I heard Jonathan's car engine fade into the night silence. I listened to that sound with a sense of complete despair, each fading rumble another reminder of his betrayal. When the sound finally disappeared completely, I made a promise to myself, through a mixture of anger and grief. I will never let Julian suffer because of his father's actions. I was determined to save my son, no matter what it took. As the night slowly passed, Julian fell asleep in my arms. But I couldn't allow myself to sleep. His irregular breathing was a constant reminder of how fragile our situation was. We had no money for treatment, and no one to turn to for help. Still, giving up wasn't an option, not when it came to my son. The next morning, before the sun rose, I got up and started preparing breakfast for both of us. I made a simple meal with what little ingredients we had left, then headed to the village market with Julian. He was too weak to walk, so I carried him in my arms the entire way. His weight on my body felt like the physical manifestation of the responsibility, now resting solely on my shoulders. The market was bustling with activity, filled with various colors and smells. The voices of the sellers all mixed together, and hearing it made me very uneasy. What if nothing sells? What if this isn't enough? These thoughts tormented me with each step I took. "Let's do our best, Mom," Julian said with a weak smile that was barely visible. Though faint, that smile was full of hope. That small glimmer of life in my son's eyes gave me the strength to keep going. I set up in a corner of the market and started selling food to passers-by. My feet ached and my eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but I kept smiling. The coins I received each time I sold food felt like a small victory to me. As the afternoon wore on, I managed to sell a little, but it wasn't nearly enough. The crumpled bills in my pocket would barely cover dinner, let alone make a dent in our hospital debt. Still, I refused to let despair consume me. As the sun began to set, I looked down at Julian sleeping in my arms. His small face was peaceful despite all his suffering. "I have to find a way for him," I promised myself silently. Yes, I had lost Jonathan, but I couldn't lose my son too. This was my first day of surviving on my own. Though darkness still surrounded me, a small flame had been lit in my heart. It was the flame of hope that someday, somehow, we would find our way out of this storm. I didn't know how or when, but I had an unwavering determination inside me. At dawn, with the sky a pale gray, I arrived at the market again, carrying Julian, wrapped in a blanket. My body was exhausted, but my mind was sharp. There was no time for tears or despair. I had to work. Every penny I earned that day would go toward Julian's medicine. My stomach was growling with hunger, but I barely noticed it anymore. I had given all of yesterday's small portion of food to Julian. At the market, vendors were already setting up their stalls in the early morning. I found a spot where I could place my small wooden table and quietly arrange jars of home-cooked food. I had made them using the last of our ingredients. I didn't have high expectations. If I was lucky, I thought, I might sell enough to buy basic medicine and tomorrow's food. Julian was still sleeping, his head resting on my lap. The weight of his thin body was no longer just a physical burden, but a constant reminder of how fragile his life was. My 5-year-old's irregular breathing seemed to tell me that time wasn't on our side. By mid-morning, shoppers began filling the market. The air was filled with the smell of fresh baked bread and the voices of vendors selling fresh fruits and vegetables. I forced a smile and tried to catch the attention of passers-by, but most people walked past without even glancing my way. The competition was fierce, and my makeshift stand was too modest to attract much attention. "Would you like some apple pies?" I called out to a man carrying bags of vegetables. He just shook his head without stopping. Time seemed to crawl by, each minute adding another weight to my shoulders. As the midday sun climbed high and warmed the air, a bead of sweat rolled down my forehead. That's when Julian stirred and woke with a faint sound. "Mama," he called out in a soft, broken voice. "I'm here," I answered, gently stroking his forehead. Julian didn't complain or ask for anything. He just looked at me with his big, tired eyes. Those eyes held a quiet hope that tugged painfully at my heart. I kissed his cheek and squeezed his small, cold hands in mine, making a silent vow, "I'll save you, no matter what it takes." "Let's see what we can do with what we have," I said, trying to hide the desperation I felt inside. A man's attention shifted to Julian, who was quietly watching from my lap. Something in my son's expression made him furrow his brow, as if he recognized the weight of illness consuming that fragile body. "Is he sick?" he asked in a gentle voice, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. I couldn't lie, so I slowly nodded. He's 5 years old, fighting a complicated illness, I explained. The man bent down to Julian's I leave L and gave him a warm smile. Julian looked back shyly but curiously, his eyes still holding that innocence that somehow survived despite all his suffering. The stranger spoke to him with a voice full of empathy, asking how he was feeling today. Julian studied him silently for a few seconds before whispering that he felt a little better. The man gently patted Julian's head, then stood up and turned to me. He introduced himself as Justin, a pediatrician at the nearby hospital. When he asked if I'd ever taken Julian to see a doctor, I looked down shamefully. I told him we'd gone a few months ago, but couldn't afford to continue the treatment. There was a moment of silence. Justin studied my face intently, as if reading all the hardships I'd endured in the lines of exhaustion. Then, in a surprisingly strong voice, he offered to help us, free of charge. I stared at him in disbelief. I wasn't used to accepting help from strangers, especially not during such difficult times. I can't pay you, I whispered, my eyes full of embarrassment. You don't need to pay, Justin replied with a gentle smile. He told me that everyone needs help sometimes. There was something trustworthy about his tone and manner. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I wasn't alone. Can you really help us? I asked, still afraid to let hope back into my heart. Justin nodded quietly, telling me he would do everything he could to help Julian get better. I stared at him, with tears of gratitude in my eyes, feeling something I couldn't put into words. That's when I realized, help sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. My path was still uncertain, but a small light had begun to pierce through the darkness. From that day forward, Justin became our anchor. He not only dedicated himself to Julian's treatment but became the kind of friend I'd never had before. Every hospital visit, every consultation, and every kind gesture from Justin felt like a quiet promise that I wouldn't have to fight alone anymore. As days passed, Julian began to warm up to Justin. Despite his illness, my 5-year-old's face would light up whenever he saw Justin. In my son's smile, I found new strength to keep moving forward. Slowly but surely, life began to show us that hope still existed. Being abandoned by Jonathan wasn't the end of our story. Those first few months without Jonathan were an endless trial for me. Each day felt like it would never end, and the absence of the man who'd abandoned his family seemed to crush my heart. But as time passed, I understood. I had no choice but to move forward. I couldn't fall apart. My 5-year-old needed me more than anything. Each small step of progress we made together felt like coming up for air in what seemed like an endless ocean. Those first few weeks were the hardest. Julian's fever wouldn't break, I spent countless sleepless nights, and my days were a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. But Justin was always there, ensuring Julian got the care he needed while becoming my unwavering support. His presence had become more than just that of a doctor. With each visit, each gentle action, Justin became part of our daily lives. You're doing really well, Lindsay, he said one night as we waited for more test results. Those words began to heal my wounded heart. The certainty that I wasn't alone in this fight gave me new strength. After a few months, we began to see signs of Julian's recovery. His seizures became less frequent, and his energy slowly started returning. Julian was gradually getting better. One day, he managed to get out of bed without help. Then another day, he was running around the house laughing, something we hadn't heard in so long. Justin and I quietly celebrated each of these small victories. My child's smile assured me that the worst was behind us. Julian and Justin's relationship naturally blossomed over time. With his pure and open heart, Julian came to trust Justin not just as a playmate, but as a confidant. Can I become a doctor like Justin? Julian asked one afternoon while playing with the toy stethoscope Justin had given him. The words surprised Justin, but he smiled without showing any awkwardness. Of course you can. You'll be the best doctor in the world, he replied, ruffling Julian's hair. When I heard their conversation, I was overcome with emotion. It wasn't sadness, but relief. That moment seemed to show that Julian had found in Justin the father figure that Jonathan could never be. The way Julian naturally called him a papa made it clear that my son was gradually moving past his father's absence. Still, questions about Jonathan would surface occasionally. Julian used to ask, "When is Daddy coming home?" almost every day, but he started asking less, and it seemed like he was gradually forgetting about his father. Yet each time he asked, it still pained my heart. One afternoon at the restaurant, Julian looked up from his coloring and innocently asked, "Mom, do you think Dad will come back?" I fell silent for a moment. I couldn't give my son a definitive answer. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to burden those small shoulders with the weight of truth. I knelt beside him, gently stroking his hair as I answered, "I don't know, sweetie. But whatever happens, we'll be okay." Julian nodded with a small smile, as if his young heart had already reached its own conclusion. Without realizing it, he had learned to enjoy what he had rather than mourn what he'd lost. "Yeah, Mom. We'll be okay," he said, turning back to his drawing with the peaceful demeanor of a child who had found his place in the world. In that moment, I realized we had crossed an invisible line. Being abandoned by Jonathan was no longer a shadow chasing us. Julian had found happiness in our new life and no longer needed to cling to what was missing. I too had learned to let go of the pain and release my anxieties, believing in a future based on the love of those present rather than the absence of those gone. As days passed, I became more certain that Justin wasn't just filling a void. He brought a peace I never imagined I'd find again. Our life together as a trio, though not perfect, was full of love and grew more solid with each step. The old wounds began to heal, and everything finally felt like it was falling into place. Several months had passed since I decided to open the small restaurant. What started as merely a means of survival gradually became my sanctuary and greatest pride. The first few weeks were tough. We had few customers, mounting costs, and my body ached from the long hours. But slowly, things began to change. Word spread, and before I knew it, our restaurant had become a popular spot in town. Every dish I served contained my love for my son and my determination. It was proof that I needed nothing else and could move forward on my own. Julian, now healthy again, would run around the restaurant as if it were his playground. He had become a happy child, full of smiles and energy. His transformation told the story of everything we'd overcome together. "Mom, I learned how to set the napkins," Julian shouted, piling napkins on the table with a triumphant expression like he'd won a race. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Now we just need to arrange the cutlery," I replied, smiling at his enthusiasm. Every time I watched him run around, I felt overwhelming gratitude. The image of him weak and feverish months ago was fading, replaced by this vibrant, lively child. The restaurant, once just a vague idea for survival, had become the center of our lives. It wasn't just a workplace, but a home we had built together. Each dish served, each satisfied customer leaving, was proof that happiness had finally found its way to us. As time passed, our lives became calm and stable. Justin and my relationship evolved naturally, without pressure or excessive expectations. In both smiles and silence, we grew closer, supporting each other. It was more than friendship, a simple yet solid love. Julian stopped asking about Jonathan. His world now revolved around Mama and Justin, and that was enough. The 5-year-old who once stood at the edge of despair now ran through the restaurant full of energy, unafraid of the future and unburdened by the past. Watching him play filled me with inexpressible gratitude. We had survived the worst and finally found our light. We had overcome our challenges and emerged stronger than before. The family we built was the result of everything we'd lost and found along the way. For the first time in a long while, I could smile genuinely. I was certain the future was ours to live fully, free from the shadows and chains of the past. Julian's recovery is truly remarkable, Justin said one afternoon while clearing lunch tables. I nodded, watching my son with gentle eyes. It really is. At first, everything seemed impossible, but these small victories proved we were on the right path. You never had to do this alone, and you never will, Justin said simply, his words resonating like a quiet but certain promise. Justin and Julian's relationship continued to deepen as well. With his innocent 5-year-old heart, Julian saw Justin as much more than just a doctor. One day, while playing in the kitchen, Julian asked if he could call him Papa. Justin was surprised but moved, and he bent down to Julian's level and gently told him of course he could, that it would make him happy if it made Julian happy. That moment was etched in my heart as one of the most significant in my life. I had feared for so long that Julian would never overcome Jonathan's absence. But the reality was simpler. The love Julian needed had already been found in Justin. The restaurant became a symbol of the home we built together. The full tables, laughter, and aromas filling the space represented everything we had accomplished. Life began to flow naturally, no longer controlled by worries or excessive expectations. The seasons changed peacefully, and I no longer needed to count each day with anxiety. Justin and my relationship evolved at the same gentle pace. Our shared daily life strengthened our bond without any need to declare it. Just being together was enough. Justin wasn't just the pediatrician who saved Julian. He was also the man who saved me, not by forcing help upon me, but by standing beside me with infinite patience, never demanding or judging. One afternoon, while Julian was drawing in his favorite corner of the restaurant, Justin and I sat together at a back table. Julian was intently working on a picture of our family. The drawing showed 3 figures holding hands, Julian, me, and Justin. Those simple lines told more than words ever could. Look, Mom. This is us. Julian proudly showed me his artwork. I took the paper in my hands and quietly studied it. The 3 figures in that drawing meant more than just a child's artwork. It was a portrait of the family we had built together. It's beautiful, I whispered, feeling my throat tighten with happiness. Justin looked at me then, with the same quiet understanding we'd shared for months. There was no rush in our glances, no need for hasty promises. What we had was real and solid, and that was enough. The day ended peacefully, like so many others these past months. As the last customer left and I turned off the lights, a contented silence filled the restaurant. It was the feeling of finally being exactly where we were meant to be. That night, I watched from the doorway, as Justin carried a sleeping Julian to his room. I felt a peace I never thought possible. The path had been difficult, but the old wounds had healed, and something new and beautiful had grown in their place. It was a home built with love and patience. Thank you, Justin, for being here with us, I whispered softly. Justin came closer, took my hand, and placed a gentle kiss upon it. That simple gesture was enough to confirm what we already understood about each other. No words were needed. In that moment, as the quiet night enveloped our small restaurant, I realized something profound. Life isn't always about starting over from scratch. Sometimes, it's about building something better from what remains.
In the quiet streets of the small town, As twilight cast its purple shadows, the sound of Jonathan's engine broke the evening silence. A mix of confidence and anxiety churned in his chest as he navigated the narrow streets. He believed his return would mark a new beginning, that Lindsay and Julian would welcome him back as if time had stood still, forgetting the pain of abandonment. In his mind, their interrupted story could resume effortlessly, as if he were the missing piece they'd been waiting for all along. The headlights illuminated the restaurant's facade as Jonathan parked his car and stepped out with purposeful strides. Through the warmly lit windows, an unexpected scene unfolded before his eyes, stopping him in his tracks. Julian, vibrant and healthy, was running through the restaurant with boundless energy, while Lindsay and Justin watched from behind the counter, their faces glowing with shared joy. There was no trace of the sadness Jonathan had expected to find in his child's innocent features. What struck him most was the sound of natural, carefree laughter floating through the air. This wasn't the scene of grief and longing he had imagined finding. Instead of a broken family, he found one that seemed whole, perhaps even more complete than when he'd left. The bell above the door chimed discordantly as he entered, drawing all eyes toward him.
I was the first to see him. My face showed no surprise or anger, just calm indifference, as if I'd been expecting this moment all along. Justin stood quietly watching Jonathan, his composure steady but unyielding, radiating a strength that wouldn't back down. Julian, my precious boy, hid behind Justin, clutching his hand tightly, the gesture of a child who knew he was protected. Jonathan stepped forward, trying to maintain his composure, though I could see the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He told us he had come back to fix his mistakes, his voice carrying an artificial confidence. He declared that Julian needed a father, that we could be a family again. I stood my ground, arms crossed over my chest, my eyes reflecting a resolve that had moved beyond pain. I told him the simple truth, that he had left us when we needed him most, and we had learned to live without him. There was nothing left to fix. My words hit him like an unexpected blow. I could see it in his face. He had expected tears and pleading, but found only calm truth instead. It wasn't anger or accusations that overwhelmed him, but this quiet certainty. He had returned with illusions of winning us back, only to face an unbreakable wall. Jonathan raised his voice, declaring he was Julian's father, as if trying to regain control. He stepped forward toward Julian, but my son didn't move. Julian clung to Justin, who whispered something gentle in his ear. Then came my son's words, soft but clear, telling Papa that he didn't want this man here. Those words held no fear, just the brutal honesty that only children can deliver. I watched as Jonathan was shocked by the words. Everything he thought he still had now belonged to another man. This wasn't just about physical absence anymore. Julian had found the father figure he needed, and it wasn't Jonathan. Jonathan's desperate cry that we couldn't keep his son from him trembled with the despair that was slowly consuming him. Justin remained steady, calmly presenting an envelope. He explained that these were Julian's adoption papers, that Julian was now his son too. I watched as Jonathan opened the envelope with shaking hands and read the documents. The printed word brought reality right to his face. There was no more room for him in Julian's life. He had lost his right to shape our future. For several seconds, he stood in silence, trying to accept this new reality. I watched as Jonathan struggled for breath, desperately searching for excuses or arguments, but finding none that could change what was. He whispered that this wasn't fair, as if the weight of his own choices had finally caught up with him. "How could you do this to me?" he asked, his voice breaking. I stepped forward and looked him straight in the eye, my voice carrying not anger, but the steady weight of truth. I reminded him that he had made his choice to leave, and we had made ours to move forward without him. My words hit him hard. There were no tears or pleading as he'd expected, just the cold, simple truth. I could see the moment he realized he hadn't just lost his family, but any chance of making amends. The silence that followed carried more pain than any shout or accusation could have. The truth was simple but cruel: he was no longer needed. I watched him desperately searching for words, but all he found was the emptiness his absence had created. That void had been filled by another man with love and patience. This was Jonathan's real punishment, being replaced not out of obligation, but by choice. He said nothing more, just turned and walked toward the door, his shoulders slumped in irreversible defeat. As he left the restaurant, I heard Julian's voice from the back of the room, calling, "Let's go home, Papa." Those final words confirmed what we all knew: Jonathan's time here was over, forever.
The night embraced Jonathan as he stepped out of the door, his hands as empty as his shattered heart. The cold evening air wrapped around him with cruel indifference, a stark contrast to the warmth he'd left behind. As he slid behind the wheel and started the engine, he allowed himself one final glance at the golden light spilling from the restaurant windows. That place, once his home, would never belong to him again. He pulled away into the deserted street, the weight of finality pressing heavier with each turn of the wheels. Each mile that passed seemed to confirm what he now knew with crushing certainty: he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The gravity of his choices settled over him like a heavy shroud as he realized he would carry the consequences of his decision for the rest of his life.
Night had fallen completely, wrapping our small town in silence. Inside the restaurant, the tension from Jonathan's visit still lingered like a fog that wouldn't lift. Even after he left, the impact remained and hurt me. Justin and I sat at the center table, quietly processing what had just happened. I kept waiting to see Jonathan again, but when he actually showed up, it was even more of a shock than I expected. I knew this confrontation wouldn't be easy, but there was still this tightness in my chest. It wasn't fear or regret, just the simple weight of all my decisions and the changes they had brought. This was the right thing to do, I whispered to myself, seeking confirmation in my own words. In that moment, Justin reached out and gently enveloped my hand in his. He told me I had done well, his quiet voice somehow containing everything I needed to hear. With his words, I felt the heavy emotions in my chest begin to lighten. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. We had come this far, and I knew we could keep moving forward. The restaurant settled into silence again, but this time it felt peaceful rather than anxious. Warm light illuminated our table, carrying the comfort of the new home we had built together. Julian was already asleep in bed, and I could imagine his peaceful smile in his dreams. Seeing his sleeping face made me feel calm. Justin promised we would walk this path together, his words echoing like a promise of our future. I smiled back at him and nodded softly. The night deepened quietly, stars twinkling outside our restaurant windows. There would still be challenges and trials ahead in our lives. Yet I believed we had the strength to overcome them. The path we had chosen after Jonathan's departure held no regrets. It would lead us forward, surrounded by love and support. We had finally drawn that final line with Jonathan. This last confrontation had freed us, leaving no unresolved issues. Julian slept peacefully on the nearby sofa, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. His steady breathing contrasted sharply with the storm of thoughts racing through my mind. Justin watched me quietly from across the table. I could tell he understood that I needed time to process everything. He asked if I was okay, his voice gentle and patient, not pushing for an answer. I sighed and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Jonathan's words still echoed in my head, but I realized they no longer held any power over me. Yes, I answered slowly, as if setting down the last heavy burden I'd been carrying. Yes, Justin, I'm finally okay, I said, and as the words left my lips, I knew I had found what I'd been searching for all along. I had closed that chapter of my life forever. The pain was gone, leaving behind only a strange stillness, like the quiet after a storm has passed.
Meanwhile, in his car, Jonathan drove deeper into the night, each mile feeling like another step toward a bottomless abyss of despair. He couldn't accept what had happened at the restaurant, desperately trying to convince himself it was all a misunderstanding, that there must be some way to change things. "I'm a father, I can't imagine being separated from my son like this," he repeated despairingly. Yet deep in his heart, he knew this battle was already lost. Lindsay's unwavering gaze, Justin's calm words, and the sight of Julian clutching Papa's hand had shown him with brutal clarity that he no longer had a place there. It wasn't his home anymore. The boy who was once his son had found the father figure Jonathan could never be in Justin. He pulled the car to the side of the road, unable to drive any further. Pressing his forehead against the steering wheel, he closed his eyes, trying to organize his scattered thoughts. The pain of failure was so intense it made breathing difficult. He had imagined his return would mark a new beginning. Instead, he faced the cruelest reality: he was no longer needed. He sat motionless for several minutes, waiting for the crushing weight of guilt to ease. He hoped the wind would carry away this unbearable sense of loss. But there was no escaping the truth. There was no way back. He had made his choice when he left. And choices, he now understood, always came with consequences. He would have to live with those consequences for the rest of his life. That was his true punishment. Returning to the restaurant had been his last card to play. Now that he'd played it, he had nothing left. He had lost everything, and lost it forever. It wasn't fate that had separated him from his son. His own absence had created a void, and another man had filled it with love and dedication. Justin hadn't stolen Jonathan's place. He had earned it through countless days of steady devotion.
I rose from the table and walked over to Julian, who was sleeping peacefully on the sofa. I gently kissed his forehead, feeling his soft warmth against my lips. This child was my greatest reason to keep moving forward. Everything we had overcome had been worth it. Julian was healthy, happy, and surrounded by love. And I had finally found the peace I had been seeking for so long. Justin quietly approached and placed his hand on my shoulder. His gentle touch spoke volumes without words, telling me he would always be there. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quietness of his warm touch wash over me. There were no grand promises or perfect plans. Just the certainty that I would never be alone again. "Thank you, Justin," I whispered, feeling gratitude well up from deep within my heart. He replied softly, saying he would always be there, his gentle tone confirming he was exactly where he belonged. As night wrapped around our small town, I realized we had finally reached the place we'd been searching for. There were no more ghosts of Jonathan, no more burdens from the past. What we had built was a new life, shaped by love and dedication. It wasn't a life defined by past pain or failures, but by what we had now and what we would build together. Our restaurant was filled with warm light and laughter. It had become more than just a place to serve meals, it was a symbol of where we could grow together, Justin, Julian, and me. We were ready to move forward without being haunted by the past. Our path ahead might not be perfect, but each step would be sure and strong. Stars twinkled in the night sky as silence embraced our town. I took a soft breath, savoring the peaceful feeling spreading through my chest. I knew now that after all our trials, new hope and love were waiting for us. Being together was enough. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and most importantly, it was ours.
As dawn began to break and Jonathan drove through the last street of town, his engine's roar tried to drown out the silence surrounding him. But no amount of noise could erase the reality he faced. His failure was complete and overwhelming. He had lost not just his family, but any chance of redemption. As he drove, fragments of scenes flickered through his mind like a broken film reel. The moment Julian called Justin Papa, Lindsay's unwavering gaze as she declared they had moved on without him, and those adoption papers that proved he no longer had a place in his son's life. Aimlessly, Jonathan pulled into an empty gas station. He stepped out, leaving the door open, hoping the cold air might ease the weight in his chest. He placed his hands on the hood, hanging his head, trying unsuccessfully to quiet the storm in his thoughts. For the first time in his life, there was absolutely nothing he could do. No excuse could repair what he had broken. The absence of Lindsay and Julian felt like a growing void within him. He had convinced himself that his bond with them was unbreakable. But reality had struck him down without mercy. Love, he learned too late, doesn't wait forever. The cold dawn wind brushed his skin, but he felt nothing. He felt suspended in a moment where time had stopped. He couldn't help but wonder when exactly he had lost everything. Was it the night he walked out, leaving Lindsay and their sick child alone? Or was it even earlier, the moment he chose his own freedom over the people who loved him?
The morning light filled our restaurant quietly and peacefully. Our new family, Justin, Julian, and I, had finally been freed from the burdens of the past, wrapped in love and tranquility. It wasn't perfect, but it was real and true. That day, for the first time, I felt truly at peace. Our future was full of hope as long as we were together. We could finally live in the present without being chained to the ghosts of our past. Through the restaurant windows, warm, comfortable sunlight flooded the dining room. The air was filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and brewing coffee, announcing the start of a new day. I moved slowly between tables, carefully straightening the last tablecloth. This place wasn't just a workplace, it was a symbol of everything I had built. Julian, healthy and strong again, ran around the restaurant with pure joy, carrying dishes as if they were precious treasures. His cheeks were rosy, his eyes sparkling with a light I hadn't seen before. He proudly called out to show me how he'd learned to arrange the spoons, holding up his tray with small hands. I smiled and told him it was perfect, not hiding the overwhelming love I felt for him. It wasn't just a mother's smile, it was the expression of someone who had watched their child triumph over what seemed impossible. From the kitchen, Justin watched us with quiet joy and contentment. We didn't need grand gestures or dramatic words. The peace we had found had seeped into every corner of our lives. We had weathered the storm, and here we were. Together, we had everything we needed. Julian set down his tray and ran to Justin, wrapping his small arms around him. He asked if he could help in the kitchen, looking up at Justin with hopeful eyes. Justin told him of course he could, but first he needed a chef's hat, tousling Julian's hair playfully. Watching them, my heart filled with a happiness that needed no explanation. Everything I had ever wanted was right there. My son's health, a stable home, and love, it had all come quietly but stayed with unwavering strength. The morning flowed naturally, as it always did. Regular customers arrived one by one, filling the restaurant with cheerful conversation and laughter. Each dish I served was like a small tribute to my own resilience. It was my gratitude for how life, even while testing me, had given me a new beginning. At the end of the day, after the last customer left, I sat quietly at a back table for a few minutes. From there, I could see Justin and Julian playing near the kitchen. The scene was simple but held overwhelming power, bringing tears to my eyes. The tears in my eyes weren't from sadness, but from a peace so profound I could barely comprehend it. I had healed all my wounds, released all my fears, and left every burden in the past. Most importantly, my happiness no longer depended on anyone else. That was my greatest victory. Justin noticed me watching and smiled, then slowly came over to sit beside me. No words were needed. The silence between us was comfortable and full of meaning. He gently asked me how I was feeling. Perfect, I answered, naturally taking his hand in mine. Just then, Julian ran to us and climbed onto my lap. Our little family was born from pain but strengthened by love. This peaceful embrace was something no one could ever break. As night fell quietly over the town and darkness settled in the restaurant, I gazed at the stars through the window and took a deep breath. For the first time in so long, I felt light, fulfilled, and at peace. This was the future I had always dreamed of, and now I was living it without fear. There were no more ghosts haunting me, no more broken promises to mourn. I had found everything in Justin and Julian, but most importantly, I had found myself. We're exactly where we've always wanted to be, I whispered to myself, holding Julian tight. Justin watched us with gentle eyes. In that moment, I knew I would never feel lonely again. We had been reborn. And that was the sweetest victory of all.